You're on the air with Florenza, your podcast destination for authentic conversations with a twist. So, grab your favorite drink, get comfy, and join me on this unique literary journey. Cheers! With experience at the Philadelphia Inquirer and Detroit Free Press, Charles B. Fancher is a journalist, editor, and former corporate communications executive. His lecturing engagements have included Howard University and Temple University. He lives in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. Spanning generations from the Civil War to Reconstruction, his historical novel, Red Clay, tells the intertwined stories of an enslaved Black family and their white owners. An elderly white woman's search for her family history unearths long-hidden secrets spanning Alabama, Paris, and New Orleans. Drawing on Fancher's family history, the novel explores themes of ambition, betrayal, and the lasting impact of racial history. Please put your hands together and welcome Charles to the show. Thank you so much, Mr. Fancher, Charles B., for joining me for this episode of On the Air with Florenza. And as I told you before we came on the air, I am really thrilled about having this interview with you. But before we get started, as is my tradition, we are going to toast to a fantastic show. And I have a little Riesling today. And are you toasting with anything on your end?
Well, I'm toasting just with water at the moment, but later on this evening, you can be sure that we'll have something with a little more heft.
Well, there you go. Cheers.
Cheers.
Mm-hmm. Please tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and throw in maybe a little known fact that we wouldn't always find available online.
All right. Well, how about this? I was born in a hospital in Selma, Alabama, which is the same hospital, or it was, it's not there now, but it was the same hospital in which the Bloody Sunday people who were injured were taken for treatment.
Whoa. Now, is there anything going on with you in that bit of history that perhaps it would find its way in a book?
Well, there are little bits and pieces of it that show up in Red Clay, but also some other projects that I have planned for the future. I can tell you that I spent most of my career as a journalist, and bounced back and forth between journalism and corporate communications, and finished my career teaching in the School of Communications at Howard University in Washington. But all of my life, in all of my career, I've been a communicator. And I think communication can take lots of different forms. And this book, Red Clay, I think is the latest iteration of that. I'm a Southerner. As I said, I was born in Alabama, and we lived there for most of my early childhood until my teen years, when we moved to Nashville, Tennessee. And I graduated from high school there, went to college at the University of Tennessee over in Knoxville, and had a career that took me from after college back to Nashville, where I worked for a local TV station, then to, of all things, the Opryland complex in Nashville that included the Grand Ole Opry House, to New York City to work for ABC Television, been to Philadelphia, where I really spent a lot of my career, Philadelphia Inquirer, to Detroit for the Detroit Free Press, back to Philadelphia, and then to Washington for where I worked for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and eventually to Howard.
during all of that time of being in the information setting, right, to where you're surrounded by knowledge and facts and stories, did you ever see yourself evolving to the place that you would be an author, or was that a natural transition for you?
Well, I think like so many journalists and other communicators, we all think that we've got the great American novel
Uh-huh.
uh, boiling and cooking inside of us. Uh, but I never took that seriously until a conversation that I had a few years ago with my mother, who is a very decorous woman. And we were down in Nashville visiting her. And she started telling me stories about her grandfather,
Uh-huh.
who in whose home she had been raised. Her father died at a relatively young age, and she and her brother and their mother went to live with my great grandfather. And I knew a little bit about him, but I'd never met him. He died 6 years before I was born.
Uh-huh.
But all of a sudden, these stories were pouring out. And the character that she was portraying was a fellow who was a little bit of a rogue, but a deeply, deeply committed family man. Who was driven every day by making sure that his family, their descendants, would have a good life.
Uh-huh.
Um, and but he had this little roguish streak too. And she told me a few little stories. And she said, you should write a book about him. He'd be a great story. And I thought, well, that actually is a good idea. And especially because he was 8 years old at emancipation. He was born into slavery. And I started doing some research casually at first, and she was sending me little handwritten notes as she thought about things that she
Uh-huh.
hadn't told me. And there came a point, however, as often is the case in African American families, when you're looking for official records and
Mm-hmm.
data, we start hitting brick walls. But I had hit a point where this man had become very real to me.
Yes.
And though I never met him, I had spent time in the house that he had built with his own hands. I had spent time with my grandmother, his daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And this picture was coming into my mind of this very proud, very strong man who had defied considerable odds to make a good living for himself coming out of slavery as he grew up, and getting through Reconstruction and the Jim Crow years. And I thought, I think I can tell a story that is more true, that has more depth in the form of a novel
Mm-hmm.
than in the narrative nonfiction work that I had tried. And
Yes.
that was how Red Clay came to be. Red clay, the title referring to the red clay soil in southern Alabama, and also to the blood that was spilled in that soil in the war, and in Jim Crow years with lynchings and all that. It is one of the constants that runs through that part of the world.
When you were initially approaching this story from a very historical nonfiction perspective and hitting those brick walls, how freeing was it for you when you realized this can best be told in fiction? Did you have that aha moment? And it was like, yes, this is it? Or was that like a gradual revelation for you?
No, I think it was a thunderclap moment of the type
Yes.
that you described, where just all of a sudden it hit me that this is what I need to do. This is the
Mhm.
story that I can write. This is the one that will tell the true story, that will move people's hearts, and perhaps help them to think about the world in which they live now in ways that they might not have otherwise.
One of the things that drew me into Red Clay was the authenticity of voice. I could hear their voices. There was no altering of their speech to fit today. It was very authentic, as was those who were non-enslaved. What was that process like for you, being such an educated man? Did you find yourself going to a special place? Did you have to surround yourself with music, with art? What did you do to tap into the voices of the characters?
You know, um, I'm not a young guy.
No.
I, I have, I've got a few years
Uh,
on me, but consequently, as I mentioned earlier, I was able to spend time with my grandmother,
mhm,
the daughter of the man who's at the center of Red Clay.
mhm.
So she was just barely removed from the slave years herself.
Okay.
And her contemporaries down there in South Alabama. And so those speech patterns were still surviving when I was a child. And you know, they imprinted, it was easy to summon them up.
Mhm.
And it felt very natural to slip into the voices of people who um, had been enslaved and then later um, found their way in the world of Reconstruction and all that came later.
Also in the book, you take us back and forward, back and forward, back and forward to these time jumps, right? To where we get in this time machine and we're transported back into time, and then we're teleported back to today. When you were writing, did you write everything out that was today and yesteryears, or did you find yourself just writing it as the story unfolded?
Well, the device that I used, it forms the underpinning of the novel. It's one in which, when Felix,
Hmm.
the main character at the beginning, has died,
Hmm. Hmm.
and at the funeral, and by now this is in 1943. The funeral, this old white woman shows up, and she is the daughter of the plantation owner that where Felix had been born and raised.
Hmm.
They have a history. They share a name. They share a certain set of memories, but they were in completely different worlds. And she feels compelled to try to resolve that. And so she has come and she sits down and talks with um, Felix's granddaughter.
Granddaughter. Hmm.
And so that provided me with a framework. In in the 1940s, this old white woman, the young black woman, are talking, sharing memories of the same person who each of them knew in totally different ways,
Yeah.
so that a picture begins to emerge of who he was. And there's a process of discovery that goes on for each of them.
Hmm.
They are learning things about themselves. So, in order to tell this story, we have to go back.
Hmm.
and see some events that take place through the old white woman's eyes. Adelaide is her name. And we see other parts of the story through the eyes of Felix as told by him to his granddaughter.
Yes.
And the two stories come together. They're interwoven as much as are the fates of these two families that have the same surname. But beyond that, there's not much that they have in common.
Not much. How important is it for today's generation to understand that when we talk about slavery, enslavement, that it wasn't as one-sided as perhaps the newer generations are led to believe?
Well, nothing is ever totally black and white.
Correct.
And it was that ability to maintain a sense of self that I believe enabled Black people like my great-grandfather to survive and even prosper in a world that was hostile to them from many different directions. And you can even say that to some degree that's true today. People have professional careers and they carry out those responsibilities, from 9 to 5. But then they have another community in which they live the rest of the time.
Yes.
And it's that ability to move back and forth, to find value in each of them, that makes a whole person. And that was one of the traits that I think I found admirable in Felix, his ability to know who he was, what he was about, and what he needed to do to make his family survive and prosper, while at the same time navigating a world that was sometimes hostile.
Did your grandmother read Red Clay? And if so, what were her thoughts of how you took the nuggets that she gave you and transformed it into a masterpiece?
Well, actually, it was my mother.
Your mother?
Yeah, my mother who was doing this. She was Felix's granddaughter and was raised in his house. And she was fascinated. She was, I think, surprised at how it all turned out.
Family really, truthfully, is the core of Red Clay. Both families is the essence of the story itself. One of the things also that I appreciated about Red Clay was that it didn't end with just emancipation, that you delve into Reconstruction, what life was like after that. How important was those aspects of history for you to be included in Felix's story?
Hugely important, because I think that's really where it happens. In a lot of ways, the first part of Red Clay is as much the story of Pleasant, my great-great-grandfather, as it is of Felix, who's a boy during most of the first third of the book. But it's in that second and third parts of the book where Felix comes into manhood that we start to really get a sense of who he is and what he is about and what drives him. It's I think that's where it is.
If the book was to be optioned for a movie, which I absolutely hope that it does, I really believe that this story deserves the big screen or a 6-part. Netflix, whoever's listening, this needs to be a 6-part series. Is there anyone that you have in mind that you would like to see play some of your characters?
That's an interesting question. I suppose I should say, from your lips to God's ears, on that question of whether it becomes a movie. But I'm not sure that I have anyone specifically in mind. There are so many bright young actors and actresses who could step into any of those roles. I do think that as an older man, Samuel L. Jackson would be a great Felix as an older man.
I wrote Samuel L. down. Absolutely. Absolutely. Last question on the book itself. There were so many twists and turns, and I have to tell you, I was almost disappointed because even though I know the setting, and even though I knew the times with my mind's mind, there were points in the story where I was rooting for certain characters to have risen above the status quo in their thought processes and their behavior. And I'm really trying to form my question well because I don't want to be responsible for spoiler alert. But I'm going to tell you, I was kind of upset with you because I was trying to root for someone and then you just snatched the rug from under me and you showed their true nature. And I am on a plane reading, right? And I just yell out, "No! Damn it, you're a bad person after all." Were there parts of the story that you loved so much that didn't make the final cut of the story?
In all honesty, I think it's all there.
Good.
I lived with this thing for a few years while I was doing the research, and then later just writing it chapter by chapter. And there came a point where the characters had all become so real to me because I was spending more time with them, I think, than I was with my real friends,
breathing friends.
And they I think writers will tell you that those characters start to speak to you.
Yeah.
And I think that by the time I was done, I felt confident that they all felt like their respective stories had been told. It felt complete to me.
Nice. There was a term, and I wrote it down. I apologize, I don't have it in front of me. There was a term that was used for ghost or spirits.
Haints.
You told the story so well that all the haints disappeared. There was no need for them to stick around and speak to you. What's next for you in terms of your role as an author? Do you have any new projects that you're working on that we should be anticipating?
I have some things that I'm working on. I'll even say that I have a completed manuscript that I've now shoved into a drawer to let it sit there and marinate, for a while before I take it out and start working back through it from the beginning. And I guess the only other thing I would say about it is that anyone who enjoys red clay will probably like this one as well.
Nice. Where are the listeners able to engage with you and interact with you?
Where?
Yes.
Well, I have I've just recently started a Blue Sky account, and it's at CB Fancher, dot BSKY
Uh-huh.
dot social. I have a Facebook page. I'm on LinkedIn, and on X now
X.
it's
Uh-huh.
called. So all of those places, you can find me.
Nice. We've come to the part of our show that I have termed One for the Road. And normally that's an opportunity for us just to have some fun and do some this or that, or one's got to go. But you have so graciously agreed to use this time to read from your book. So if you could just set the stage of what's going on, and then I am going to mute my mic because I have been known to ad lib and get involved in the readings. So this is your time to share.
Well, this doesn't require um, any setup because this is chapter 1.
Wonderful.
We're starting at the beginning. Red Clay, chapter 1. Red Clay, Alabama. Winter, 1943. Third Baptist Church, the biggest Black congregation in Red Clay, Alabama, was packed for Felix H. Parker's funeral. Church members, friends, and family, including some distant cousins from Birmingham, had gathered to say farewell on a brisk Wednesday morning in early January. They were wearing their Sunday best. The women preened with hair freshly pressed and curled beneath feathered and flowered hats, their faces covered by lacy veils, and their shoulders draped with fur stoles, little head-on fox pelts attached nose to tail, staring with unseeing beady black eyes. The men were distinguished in their suits with high-waisted pants, hand-painted ties over starched white shirts, Stetson hats resting on their knees, and spit-shined Johnson and Murphy shoes on their feet. From the front pew reserved for immediate family, Eileen Epps looked over her shoulder at the sea of black, brown, and high yellow faces and smiled. Grandpa would have loved this. She knew exactly what he would have said. White folks put us down, but damned if we don't know how to look good when we come to church. And despite her grief, the recollection of the man who lay in the casket in front of her aroused a moment of perfect joy, untethered to the physical world. She wondered, is this what the old ladies at church feel when the Spirit moves them? She could see them in her mind's eye as they would leap from their pews, throw their hands into the air, and shout, "Jesus, Jesus, help me, Jesus," before collapsing into the arms of the ushers, those white-dressed, stern-faced women with ribbons and silver badges of authority pinned above their mighty bosoms, the women who swooped in with funeral home fans and tissues to comfort those overcome by the presence of the Holy Ghost. "Watch this," Felix would whisper to Eileen whenever Eugene Wilkins got the Spirit. Eugene was an unprepossessing woman, lean and nearly 6 feet tall. She had gray eyes, surprising in her dark chocolate face, and thick white hair that she straightened on Saturday nights with a hot comb and hair grease in the kitchen of the little house she had shared with her husband 30 years earlier, before he was killed in a lumbering accident when they were still in their 20s. She had never remarried. She cooked and cleaned for a white family over in Demopolis. The Spirit didn't descend on Eugene precipitously. It enveloped her slowly until it overtook her completely, usually about midway through the preacher's sermon. First, she would sway from side to side and then rock backward and forward, matching the tempo of the preacher's oration. When he reached a crescendo, with his voice soaring up and out through open stained glass windows Like the voice of God from the burning bush, the spirit in Eula Jean would erupt. Here it comes, Felix would whisper, and nudge his granddaughter in the ribs with his elbow. Eula Jean would shoot to her feet, and her whole body would shake with her mouth open and her eyes rolled back in her head. Then she would sit down again as if the fit had passed. Before springing to her feet and stepping into the aisle to dance, she would prance to the altar, arms flailing and hat askew, and then dance to the rear of the church, following choreography known only to her, set to music that only she could hear. And when she was spent, Eula Jean would drop into her seat at the end of the pew and clutch her heart, while the ushers fanned her and wiped her brow. If Felix would have been disappointed in any part of this send-off, Eileen thought it would be because Eula Jean couldn't get the day off to attend his service.
Oh, thank you. Oh my gosh, that was wonderful. That was wonderful. Please, when that next book that's marinating in the drawer sees the light of day and is well seasoned and ready to be read, I hope that we're able to have you back on again.
Well, I certainly hope you will have me. It's been a delight.
Wonderful. Thank you. And this wraps up another episode of On the Air with Florenza. You may follow me on all social media platforms under Florenza Lee or via my website at florenza.org. Until next time, cheers.